There we go. So, welcome everybody to the Dr. Jeff and Friends podcast. And if this is your first time on the podcast, welcome. This is a podcast that's not necessarily just about medicine, and it's not just about LifeVantage. It is about me talking to some of the movers and shakers in medicine today. People that have abandoned big pharma, people that have abandoned big medicine, very similar to what I have done in my past. And tonight, interestingly enough, is a guy that sort of looks like me, another really good looking bald man, um, but also a former full time orthopedic surgeon, now still plays around with orthopedics a little bit, but has transitioned away from the corporate side of medicine, the big pharma side of medicine, and really got into taking care of people, taking care of health. And the people that he's taking care of is men's health, which is something I think is really, really lacking. So tonight's guest graduated from medical school in 1992, went on to do an orthopedic surgery residency in 1997. All of that was done at Temple University in Philadelphia. So he's a fellow educated in Philadelphia, as where I was for medical school. After that, he joined the United States Air Force and was chairman of orthopedics at Misawa Air Base in Japan for 4 years, and then in 2001 started his private practice in central Pennsylvania, which is where I was born. You can see how there's a big link here. And then spent 8 years in North Carolina. He transitioned out of orthopedics and went into the kind of cosmetic line. He was doing liposuction and tummy tucks for the company Sonobella from 2000 from 2023 to 2025. And during this time at Sonobello, he really transitioned into looking at weight management and the importance of visceral fat and metabolic disease, and how our poor diets and our sedentary lifestyle has really led Americans down the road to disease. Over the last year, he's been, for the most part, full time in men's health. Still, about 3.5 days a week, does some orthopedic office work to keep his diagnostic skills in orthopedic sharp, because once you're in orthopedics, you miss that part of your life. Now he's an expert in men's health, in andropause, in ED, and I'd love to welcome tonight my good friend, my brother from another mother, Dr. Jack Rocco.
Thank you, Jeff. That was flattering. And you're right, we do share a lot of commonality in our education, our upbringing. Central Pennsylvania boys. And we're from the part of Pennsylvania. I always think that Pennsylvania is interesting. You've got Philadelphia, which is more like New York. You've got Pittsburgh, which is its own breed, and then you've got what they call Pennsyltucky. Everything else in between. A little country, a little bit rock and roll. What I call we are real salt of the earth people. So
Yeah, definitely coal miners' kids,
yeah, yeah.
lumberjacks' kids. So
I think we're real practical people. I think we're frugal. We're sons of our fathers, and why would you want to pay for dinner at a restaurant when you can make it at home, kind of thing. So I think we really do. I think we're good-hearted people. Maybe I'm biased, but now that I'm closer to Boston, it seems a little less personal, a little, I spent some time in North Carolina as well, and I enjoy the good country guys from Central PA. So thank
yeah,
you.
no, I absolutely agree. I miss going back. I don't get back anywhere near as often as I should. So I want to get started today, and I want to throw out. So I looked at some statistics, and they're alarming. You know, when my parents were in their 60s and 70s, probably TMI, but when my parents were older. My mom was 42 when she had me. My dad was 50. So when I was a teenager, there were times where I was in my bedroom and they were behind a locked door across the hallway, lived in a small house, and I knew what was going on. And my dad was probably pushing 65 at that point and had no problems with erectile dysfunction. And today, if you look at the statistics, about 30% of men in their 30s have ED, 40% of men in their 40s, 50% of men in their 50s, you can see where this is going, and 70% of men over 60. It wasn't like that 50 years ago. So, Jack, in your opinion, what do you think's changed over the last 50 years?
Yeah, exactly. And you hit it on the mark. And I think I've also noticed that guys in their 50s or 60s tend to have, when we test them for testosterone levels, to link testosterone and ED, but you test a guy in their 50s, for testosterone, and they're around 500, maybe 4 or 500. Some are lower, but you'll get an occasional 4 or 500. In your 40s, they're around 400. In your 30s, they're around 300. So it's the same thing, just flipped. So the low T is happening in much younger guys. And it seems to be that, some guys in our generation, the Gen Xers, still have some functioning organs, functioning glands. And I don't have proof of this, but just my supposition is that we had a period in our lives where we ate real food. We went through puberty. Our testicles were nurtured at the time when they were developing. We probably had testosterone levels in 12, 15, 2000 levels, when we were in college or so. And, so if you look back at your Penn State days, the guys, you look at those guys, they were probably on roids too. I'm not
There,
going to
there
say
was a
that,
little bit
but
of that in the locker room. There's
yeah.
a lot
But
in
I
there.
mean, these guys have these massive necks, full beards, and I can remember, you go into high school as a freshman, and you're looking at the seniors, you're like, damn, these guys are men. You're in the locker room with these guys, and it was very intimidating, these guys. And my son is a wrestler now. He won Rhode Island State Championship. He finished third in New England, and very proud of him. But the guys he's going up against, there's more of a feminine look to them. There's more of a, they don't have big beards, few of them, but the percentage is low. So I do think that critical period when you're maturing, maturization, if your testicles aren't getting good food, good nutrients, good exercise, good sunlight, out with your friends, chasing girls, whatever it is, there's a priming of the system there that I think stays with you for decades and years into the future. So, like I said, for me, it seems like, when I see a guy in their 50, they're still, they grew up masculine. Guys in their 50s and 60s, 70s, they grew up masculine. They've maintained some of those masculine traits, of which ED is one of them. And, I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. One, our exposure to pornography, our exposure to female bodies all over the internet. I mean, we had to sneak a National Geographic to get a picture of a boob every now and then from some tribe in Africa, or you had your Playboys stashed under your bed or somewhere secret in the back of your car. But the exposure to female bodies and sexual promiscuity, even more advanced and hardcore sex on the internet. So it's not so novel anymore, to see a female body. And I got to imagine it's a different experience looking at it on a screen versus trying to get a girl to go on a date with you, trying to, get to first base. I mean, if we're gonna talk
Yeah.
up and we've chased the children away, I got to think that some of that is taking play, but also the expectations. Like I said, if you're a teenage kid, a senior in high school, parking over Lover's Lane. Um, we weren't necessarily, going to home base, but just some exposure to it. And I think now the expectation for this, insane sexual relationship, at a younger age, and even, even into marriage and later in life, I think it's setting expectations that are unnatural and really not conducive to that usual pattern of sexual development, of exposure and development. It's hyper idealized, and I think does play a role in what we're seeing physically and in the ailments. So yeah,
No,
eat.
I think you're right. I think a lot of what
This is
happens is we blunt that dopamine response. I think that, when we're in our day and age, if we looked at a Playboy is pretty mild, I mean, even in today's standards. But if you looked at a picture in Playboy and you saw boobs, I mean, that gave you that dopamine rush. And then when you went on a date with a girl, that was still there. And I think today, when you can get whatever you want on the internet, I mean, you can pick up your phone and get whatever porn you want. I think guys get desensitized. And then when they try to move into the bedroom, whether it's in high school or college or even post college, and the girl that's in bed with him is not performing like the girl on the screen on his phone, then he doesn't respond the way he wants to respond. He's thinking that this is wrong. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's not the way that the girl that I follow on, Pornhub functions. And why isn't my girl like that? And I think then that leads to the addiction to the porn that's on the internet. And now normal sex doesn't supply that dopamine rush that they need. I think you're absolutely right. And if you pair that, and those of you that have heard me talk, and I see people on here that are regulars on my podcast, is, we know that the world changed in the 1970s when big tobacco went away, January 1st of 1971, when tobacco ads went off of television. They turned to big food. R.J. Reynolds bought Nabisco, and Philip Morris bought General Mills. So now all the ultra high processed foods start. So oxidative stress starts. The oxidative stress is going to attack the hormones. We know that's one of the first places that oxidative stress goes. So now you're at a young age, in your teens, that when your testicles are supposed to be developing, you're being bombarded with huge levels of oxidative stress. I even look, my son's 22 and just turned 22 last week. And I look at what his diet is, and his diet is just atrocious. It's a lot of fast food, it's a lot of ultra high processed food, it's a lot of stuff that he pulls out of the freezer, heats up in the microwave. And that's not the way to get good sexual development. And we didn't have that problem in the 70s and probably even into the early 80s. Which is now a problem now, and the disparity that you were talking about, where we're seeing more ED in the 30, 40, even 20-year-old range, 20s, 30s, 40s, and then in the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s, some of those men are still rather functional because I think they're still eating a decent diet because they're eating what they remember from childhood. And they didn't have that assault when they were maturing. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I had a consultation with a guy today, 27 years old, and my point that I'm going to make is, or going to lean towards, it's not just the boys. Women are exposed to this as well. Young girls, are watching porn as well, and
You
so this.
can't just throw the boys under the bus.
Pardon me?
You just can't throw all the boys under the bus.
No, it's a generational thing, and I think, like I said, I think a lot of the toxins that we have in our diet and our water, a lot of estrogen mimickers, so I think that a lot of it is not just strictly testosterone. There's a ratio of testosterone to estrogen, and women have testosterone and men have estrogen. Um, but I think with a lot of these estrogen mimickers, I think the women are maturing younger, faster, more precocious, more sexually developed. I mean, women were always mentally above us with relationships.
And
Um,
they still probably are, because I see a lot
yeah,
of them
and
as
probably
well.
more so. And we probably max out about 22. I think I'm not much different than that now,
Yeah.
but that's what we have to deal with. Um, but I like I said, I think that the sexual promiscuity and precociousness in females, there's also a mismatch with the men. If the men have lower testosterone, their testicles really never developed, and they don't really have the ability at that young age to perform the way that women are seeing men perform and men are seeing men perform. So there's a disconnect between those natural, those natural developments
Okay.
that we grew up with. But anyways, this guy that I was consulting with today, um, we also do at our clinic, we do a male enhancement procedure. And it's not something I knew about 4 years ago, 3 years ago. Um, but as a part of the men's clinic, there's a big niche for it. And so he wants to be bigger. So now I'm having the conversation with him about, what is his size when he's flaccid, what is his size when he's erect, and how does that get into play with his girlfriend. And he's telling me, and I'm like, well, women are more like, I'm trying to be the, older statesman of sorts and give this guy some advice. And I'm like, well, with women, you can't just, jump in there and wham bam. You got to love them. You got to, they're little scared deer sometimes. And you got to romance them. And if you left a plate in the sink, she may still be holding on to that when you get into the bedroom. So, you've really got to set the mood. And he kind of shocked me a little bit. I'm always shocked. I like it when I'm shocked. But he's like, no, she wants me to be aggressive. She wants me to, I'm a mechanic. She wants me to put on my mechanic belt and role play and just get right into it. Like she's performing so then, how do I maintain? How do I, prevent from premature ejaculation, and how do I please her before I get there? And, that wasn't something that I had to deal with at that age, so um, I think there's different stresses probably that we don't even really know about just because of the generation gap. But I said I think the high estrogen is also an effect. Men are more soft nowadays. They don't have that typical male pattern muscularity. You've got a lot more man boobs, gynecomastia in some of these younger guys. Their diets.
Even the guys that go to the gym, because I think, part of that, we know that if they're taking any type of hormones to try to build in the gym, some of that hormone gets converted over to estrogen. Hence the reason, and probably way above science-wise, but aromatase inhibitors stop that transition. So, some of the guys that are even in the gym building are building those man boobs because of the increased estrogen. And then that increased estrogen is turning down their sexual aggression and their sexual response. And then they can't perform in the bedroom. And then they get angry and, whatever that leads to. And I think that could even be part of, I mean, we're seeing a lot more, things like domestic abuse. And where's that coming from? I think back when we were kids, if there was domestic abuse, it was just a guy that was kind of a hole to his girlfriend and hit her, and probably because he had too much testosterone. And I think now it might be the other way around, that they have less drive, they're less able to perform, they get frustrated, and who do they take it out on?
Yeah, I
You
think
know,
the, you know, with
so
with
it's a
with my clinic, some of this evolved out of a passion from seeing guys over the years in orthopedics, in the military. And then when I left the military, those guys always gravitated towards me as a former, as a veteran. And, the mental health aspect of things is such an important part that I think guys are experiencing. And like you said, like we didn't have all these multiple emotions growing up. We were driven on our career, our job. our sports, whatever we had at hand, men seem to be a little more focused on playing softball on the weekends. I don't see a lot of that anymore. Um, but men are struggling, I think, with, like you said, that frustration, that dichotomy, that those male female roles have changed dramatically. And I think it's got to mess with your inner psychology, your inner brainstem, your subconscious, which still has these, screamings of yesteryear and be a man. But when you don't have those same hormones to react the way that a man should react, or those same allowances to be a man, um, the confusion in young men, I think, is through the roof. Um, and I don't want to get into, the controversy of gender roles and, trans rights or human rights and all that stuff. But, the fact that we talk about this so openly now, which is, a tranny to talk about it when we were growing up was just non-existent.
Right.
I didn't know what that was growing up. But for now, for it to be, everyone is so hyper focused, so nuanced about, oh, I'm cis, trans, bi, fluid, so many words that are confusing to me as someone who is supposedly sexually mature. For a young man, like I said, this 27-year-old I was talking to, um, I was having conversations with him that I would have never considered at the time. I mean, it just seems like there's a difference. And I tend to my a lot of my thinking. I wrote a book on my adoption journey, which went into me as I was adopted as an infant, and I went through my journey under the model of nature, nurture, and free will. And I had to try and break down my identity, who I was naturally, who I was born as, and I was born Larry, and Larry's parents were English and black. And then I was adopted as Jack. So at 6 weeks of age, my identity it was changed into Jack. So Jack became this new individual that was pure nurture in a lot of ways. Like I was purely, grew up in the Italian nurtured environment. And then once I found the truth of my parents, then I had to kind of come up with my free will, like who is me? Am I my natural self, my nurtured self? And I think a lot of that is true with sexual, sexual function, sexual, that men, I think, have a natural
Yeah, I still,
drive,
yeah.
an innate, subconscious masculine self. Um, and then culture has changed things into more, you need to be in touch with your feminine side, you need to be in touch with your emotions, you need to understand a female has to understand a man. So everyone's second guessing their nature, their nurture, their free will. It's just a highly confusing thing that I think does show itself in a lot of maladaptive behavior. Um, if you look at a lot of the serial rapists, the serial killers, a lot of these people, there was always, or oftentimes, a sexual frustration. David Berkowitz attacking young women. Some of these notorious, Ted Bundy, acting out their frustrations in a maladaptive way, in a totally pathologic way against women. And these guys were mild-mannered people, quote unquote. They weren't, aggressive animal bikers kind of thing. So I just think there's a lot of, things that are falling, that are being shown in society from these these hormonal dysfunctions. This low testosterone when you should be a man, this high estrogen levels. So, the hormone system is, I look at it as like, a liquid nervous system in a way. The nervous system is, typically your electrical system. And I think the hormonal system is more of a liquid neurosystem, that it's in your
Mhm.
blood. It's, it creates an environment, a milieu of behavior that then is modified by the nerves, and if the milieu is the environment in which your nerves are functioning is also maladaptive or doesn't have the proper concentrations or percentages of hormones, it's a very confusing thing to the body, to the psyche, to the social being. Um,
Mhm.
so it's highly complex, but it's what we're dealing with nowadays that we didn't have to. The metabolic disease, the foods, the estrogen mimickers. Um, it's a huge part, and the fact that so many people are talking about all this, the different toxins in their system and the ultra processed foods. And even if we did eat a lot of Burger King or McDonald's back in the day, it was probably more likely to be actual beef and
Yeah,
actual cheese. Whereas now the ingredients in Cocoa Puffs or Pop Tarts are not the same as they used to be.
right. Absolutely. So we've talked about what's led us to the point that we're at now. So why don't you tell the audience what are you doing about it? What are you doing when the 38-year-old male is now struggling with sex? He has ED, his marriage is falling apart. The wife is talking about leaving and taking the kids to another state, and now he's saying, Dr. Rocco, what am I going to do? How did I get into this mess? And
Right.
maybe he's 50 pounds overweight and he's got metabolic syndrome and all of this is going on. What are you doing?
Well, exactly. And that's what I love about my transition now because, Jeff, the typical doctor's appointment. What are you here for? I'm here for my knee. Can you look at my hip? Well, your insurance company won't let me look at your hip. I can only look at your knee, and that's within orthopedics. And it's the same thing, if someone comes in now with me and, the first thing I'm doing, a lot of these guys have the big bellies. They're young guys, they're already overweight. So I know they've got metabolic disease. And the thing that I really learned or honed my skills on with Sono Bello is the difference between, superficial fat and visceral fat. And the visceral fat is really bad toxic fat. And that is the fat behind the muscle. And I use the analogy of you see that truck driver getting out of his truck at a truck stop. I try to present a visual. Guy hops down. He's got a big belly in front of him, a big country belt on below him. He's pulling his belt up. But as that guy's walking, he's kind of walking with a sway back, you know? And a lot of these guys, I golf with these guys, and they're like, Doc, what can you do about my belly? And, I'll pound on their belly, and he goes, but look at it. He goes, I got a big belly, but look at it. It's all muscle. I'm like, nope, dude, that's not muscle. You're pregnant with fat. All the fat is below the muscle. So they, especially in men, because of our hormones, we distribute weight differently, distribute fat differently. There's very little pinchable fat. So someone like that is not a good candidate for liposuction. They need diet, and if, they need to get rid of that visceral fat because it's surrounding the heart, it's surrounding the intestines.
Right, that's the fat that kills you. I mean,
Yeah,
it's the fat that leads to mortality because if it's around if it's around your colon and in your
yeah,
lower belly, it's around your heart, it's around your liver, it's around your kidneys, and that's what leads to death. And I know that when we first had the discussion, so for those of you that are on here that are on my Life Vantage team or on the Life Vantage team around the world, because I see somebody on from Australia up on the pictures above my screen. Uh, Jack joined us in Life Vantage about a year and a half ago and is using it in his practice. And I know that he loves Protandim NRF2 for decreasing the oxidative stress. Was a big fan of the mind body and has put many, many, many patients on the mind body, even when he was doing Sono Bello. And I'll let him talk about that. So I know that that is a step in your protocol. So I'll let you go ahead and continue.
yeah. So like I said, so these guys, so the first thing I'm looking at, I'm like, one, just raise awareness, so that's a main thing. Two, bring it back to the weight because that's often the problem. And when you're talking weight, then you're talking diet. So I talked about the visceral fat, and I got a buddy recently who had a small bowel obstruction for no reason. Like he went in, but he's got one of those big bellies. I'm like, Ken, your abdomen is filled with fat, and that pressure you feel on the outside is translating to your intestines. Your intestines aren't moving the way they should. They're pushing against the fat. They're smothered in there. So, you have to, if you're talking testosterone, you often have to talk about, what's your body weight, what's your ideal body weight, what's your muscle mass. Um, and that's where, I'll introduce the Life Vantage products, the mind and body. And I think that's, for me, it's a no-brainer. Because a lot of these guys, they come and they want to be on Ozempic, they want to be on tirzepatide, Wegovy, and I'm like, I hear you. You do need to lose weight, and you're on the right track with the GLP-1s, but to receive an exogenous, an outside source of the GLP-1 is further creating more and more confusion in your body. So your body has all these mechanisms. All we're doing is, with medications, is mimicking what the body naturally does. So instead of adding another problem, another variable on it, why not try to, strip things down to the basics? Let's get yourself healthy. Let's clear out your oxidative stress. Let's work on that fat, but let's work on that fat by stimulating your body's own production of GLP-1. That's the key. Because if you can stimulate, and look at you, Jeff, my God, you're half the man I used to know. And it really is, it's such a, like I said, we're simple country boys from Central PA. Why are you going to add another variable that you're trying to hit the target with while you're moving and shooting and throwing with your left arm? It's making things complicated. Let's just focus. Let's simplify. Let's lose the weight. How am I going to lose the weight? Good question. And I think it is a difficult question because a lot of people already come to you with, type 2 diabetes, and I'm a big proponent of fasting. I think once again, if we get back into nature, from the nature side of things, humans weren't designed to walk into the refrigerator at 10 o'clock at night, and grab whatever food you can. And if you're eating nonstop all day long, your body's always secreting insulin. Well, if you're secreting insulin, insulin's just going to do its job. Insulin's a hormone as well. It's going to do its job, and insulin's job is to take glucose and turn it into fat. You don't need that much. It's only something like a couple cubes of sugar in your entire bloodstream that is your normal blood level. So you eat a cheesecake, a piece of donut, whatever, even
Leftover
simple
pizza.
food, simple bread, pizza, any carbs, you're getting a sugar load. You're getting a high reaction with insulin. So insulin's going to be with you for 12 hours now. So for the next 12 hours, insulin's going to be taking sugar and putting it somewhere for fat. And until those 12 hours done, if you eat another meal before that 12 hours expires, you get another hit of insulin and another hit. So you really are living 24/7 with some insulin in your system. You could have lunch at noon, go to the gym at 5 and work out on the treadmill, but you've still made fat while you were in the gym because you still have insulin in your system. So you're like, "Oh, I burned 300 calories." You might have burned the calories, you burn the calories that are in your blood, but you didn't, because you still had insulin, you didn't pull any of those calories out of fat. So the 12-hour rule for fasting, and a lot of people will do a 16-8 combination of fasting for 16 hours and eating for 8. So I tell people, pick an 8-hour window, whatever you want to do, 11 to 7, 10 to 6, find 8 hours. That's your eating window. And I don't even put a lot of pressure on them. I don't have high expectations at first. I'll say, well, just, eat whatever you want during those 8 hours. If you eat well, if you eat real food, even better. But if you want pizza, you want a donut, only eat it during those 8 hours. But then spend 16 hours of fasting. And once they get used to that 16 hours of fasting, it changes their hunger. They're not craving the sugar. Their body's making, if you get on the GLP-1s, if your body starts making the GLP-1, it satisfies your pleasure centers in the brain. You're like, I'm full. I don't need a cheesecake. You don't crave it. But insulin controls that hunger as well. So I talk about the GLP-1 products. I talk about the antioxidants, the NRF2 Protandim product, and I talk about fasting. And I think the people that listen to me, my office manager, we did a podcast not long ago. He's 35, he's Hispanic, and he's got a big beard, he's got a big masculine appearance to him, but he had a little paunch to him, he had a little belly. So I said, let's get you on testosterone. We checked his testosterone level at 35, Hispanic guy, big beard. You'd expect him to be masculine. His testosterone level was 125. 300, below 300 is agreed upon by everyone that 300 is low T. Below 300 is low T. Everyone agrees on that. So this is a 35, 37-year-old with a level of 130, 125, and he's got the belly. So I got him on the testosterone. I got him on the GLP-1 and the Protandim. He's lost 30 pounds now in about 4 months, and his testosterone level is normal again. He feels wonderful. He tells me that he's sleeping. He's going to sleep on time. He's he's not craving the foods like he has to. He says he stopped drinking coffee, not because he doesn't like coffee, he doesn't need coffee anymore. So I think, like I said, by simplifying things, by losing the weight, getting back to basics, cutting away the waste, cutting away the excess food, cutting away the excess stimulants with coffee has made a tremendous difference. I don't have to be a rocket surgeon, a rocket scientist to figure that out. By simplifying, I'm doing more by simplifying as opposed to trying to throw multiple darts with multiple medications and insulin and metformin and all these medicines that what are they doing to an individual person? You don't know. Everyone reacts differently. So too many variables when I start getting into medications. I try to simplify. Let's work on the weight. We work on the weight, we work on the hormones, we work on the GLP-1. The sleep will be better, your appetite will be better. It really improves a lot of things with minimal effort. It makes medicine enjoyable and simple and intuitive.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that, and I didn't realize, and probably TMI for a lot of people on this call that are people that listen to me all the time, but when I was 300 and almost 350 pounds, you know, sex was difficult. You mean just physically difficult. And as I looked into it, um, I didn't realize that for a man to complete a sexual act, you need to be able to um, use the energy that it would take to walk up 10 flights of stairs. And if you can't walk up 10 flights of stairs, then you probably can't have sex to completion.
Yeah, I
So if you
believe it.
think about somebody that's 40 pounds overweight, 50 pounds overweight, they can't do that. They do not have the metabolic reserve, the energy reserve to be able to do that. And that's
Right.
leading to part of the ED. We would see patients in the office that would come in and say, Doc, I can get started, but once I get started, I get short of breath and then I lose it.
Right.
Well,
And
yeah, I mean,
how do you
because
focus
blood
on it?
now doesn't
Yeah,
want to go to that area. It wants to go to your heart, so you live.
yeah.
Uh,
How do you focus on an erection or focus on pleasing your partner when you don't know where to put your knee, when you can't assume a position that is comfortable. Um, Too many variables. So like I said, I think you know it, it goes back to the basics. Sexual function improves with the weight loss. Um, Relationships, if you what's wrong with me, why can't you get an erection, don't you find me attractive anymore, so
right.
now and then you've got a female who also may be going through menopause, and I'm very glad that they removed the warning label, the black box warning from estrogen, that I hope that as men get on testosterone more, and we're working with, I'm looking into, we're the ultimate men's clinic, but a pharmacy talked to me about including a female hormone program where they'll do the labs, they'll make an assessment, it's a compounding pharmacy, so they'll be able to, come up with a mixture that satisfies the women's needs. So if you can get both the men and the female, um, both with weight, hormonally balanced, active, well sleep, well rested, and without a whole lot of toxins
And
involved.
it saves a marriage.
Yeah, the relationship.
Clearly saves a marriage.
Yeah, and like I said, in my mind, you don't have to be a physician to figure this out. You just have to be someone who's been a human on the planet for a long period of time to know that you're going to perform better, you're going to be in a better mood, you're not going to be so cranky. You're not working in survival mode. You're in relaxation mode. You're in enjoyment mode. Um, and that's where people should be,
So
you
I
know.
think this is a great segue for one of the questions that I have up on my screen. And I think that segue is, and I think men have been not looked at as far as this being a problem with aging. I think that andropause, male menopause, is something that's relatively new, probably within the last, really coming up in the last 10 years, where menopause in women has been known for 40 or 50 years, and they although probably not treating women correctly with estrogen and progesterone 50 years ago, but they were doing it, and then they found it was bad, and now it's back because there's better compounded ways of doing it. But that I think that mismatch between menopause, which is understood, and andropause, which is still misunderstood, leaves a gap. And I know we would see in the office women that would come in because their doctor told them, "Oh yeah, you're going through menopause. There's nothing you can do about it." And they would talk to somebody that had been a former patient of ours, and they'd come in, and we had things that we could do about it, and we could treat their menopause, whether we would supplement it with hormones, or we would do something like the O shot that Dr. Reynolds developed, where you put PRP to get things more blood flow down in that area, make sex better, decrease stress incontinence. And then they would start feeling great, and their complaint would be, "Doc, what can I do for my husband?
Yeah,
He's not keeping up anymore.
yeah.
I want to have sex, and he's 50 pounds overweight and tired all the time, and going to bed at 9 o'clock. And by the time I go to bed, he's snoring like a freight train, and we don't have a sex life anymore. And, we're only in our 50s, and, what can we do about that? And that's why I think it's great what you're doing at the Ultimate Men's Clinic.
Yeah. And then, the kids leave the house, you get your empty nesters, and, you lose a lot of your identity with that. What am I
Yeah.
going to do now? I actually have to spend time with my husband, spend time with my wife. I can't use my kids as a distraction. And, oh, they got a basketball game tonight. Oh, I got the prom next week. You have to actually like look back at your spouse and say, let's try and get along again. But if the physical attraction, if the physical ability isn't there anymore, the desire, you get a lot of those, late life divorces. Um, the 60-year-old dating a 20-year-old, and not just men, women as well. That it really has disrupted the fiber of and the fabric of the American relationship and the American family in so many ways.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So I'm going to give you one last question. This is the closing question. Before I do that, go ahead and plug your book for those people that might want it. How do people get your book?
I don't have, oh, do I have, nope, don't have a copy of it. My book is called Recycled. It is, like I said, it's called
It's
Recycled.
amazing, by the way. I had one of the first copies. We're friends, so you
Yeah.
sent me a copy
Yeah,
very
I was,
early on.
it's
Amazing. I read
something.
it. I handed it off to Jennifer, my wife. She read it. Both think it was absolutely amazing. So if you wanna read Dr. Rocco's book, we can. So it's called Recycled, and you can get
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's recycled. You can get it on Amazon. Like I said, and it's that journey that I try to explain. I think the adopted personality is something that's very misunderstood, but something that's very intriguing. If you look through all of media, Moses, Superman, Steve Jobs, and I said both, David Berkowitz as well as Ted Bundy, so the range of adoptees is very wide because most of your life you're pretending to be someone who you're not. Like I said, from the natural side, you're not really, I was never really Jack as a natural being. Jack was, concrete that was put on a facade put on top of Larry. And, I guess I had to deal with a lot of these issues later in life, went through a divorce, and I'm like, what the hell's wrong with me? And I started digging into it. So I'm proud of it, but I think it's not just adoptees. It's something we all face. That public face, that internal face that you have, and dealing with that free will. It's recycled and a reluctant search for true self through nurture, nature, and free will. So it brings a lot of thought. I don't come up with as many answers, but definitely proud of it. So thank you for plugging that, Jeff.
Absolutely need to plug it. So last question.
Go
If
ahead.
you could change one thing about the trajectory of men's health in America over the next 10 years, what would you change?
Well, I think it's happening slowly, but it's more awareness. It's men's acceptance of their vulnerability. It's their acceptance of their humanity. Some of our superhuman abilities are what makes us men. Oh, he worked 34 hours he worked 78 hours this week. He did a 24-hour shift. Like we pride ourselves in that invulnerable aspect. But by grasping our vulnerability and our humanity, our psychology. I think I always say it's the big head, not the little head. I think a man has to know his limitations, has to know, the signals when instead of ignoring the signals of poor health, both mental health as well as physical health, relationship health. Um, we tend to brush those things under the carpet, so I think awareness of our vulnerability and acceptance of our vulnerability, um, realizing that, we spend more time taking care of our weed whacker, you
Yeah,
know, our lawnmower than we do our own physical bodies. So
absolutely
I
true.
think we need to put that same focus that we put into engines into our own engine, our own
Yeah,
body.
no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a great way, a great answer. I met with a doctor today and talking about a patient that I had referred to him, and he said, he said, do you have any treatments for long COVID? I think I have long COVID. And I said, well, why do you think that? I said, when did you have COVID? And he said, oh, 4 years ago. But he said, mid-afternoon, I'm always tired. I feel like I need to take a nap. And I said, well, what's your testosterone level? And he said, well, I don't know. I had it drawn, 8 months ago, 9 months ago. Let me look. He looks on his phone. He said, oh, it's 164. I said, that's why you have afternoon fatigue. It has nothing to do with the COVID that you had 4 years ago.
Yeah. But
I said,
also the
you're
ranges.
60 years old, you're going through andropause, and you need testosterone. I don't know if I want to take testosterone.
Yeah.
Well, then, this is something you've got to think about.
But here's the thing we didn't cover. It's like it's a generational thing. It's a human thing. All men's testosterone levels have shifted downward so that the low normal level on LabCorp's values is 264. So if you have a level of 270, you'll get your lab work from your primary care physician. It'll say
And you're normal.
normal. Meanwhile, you're at 270, which everyone agrees is low T. But they measure based on what they're finding in the population, not on what some, inherent normal is. So the ranges of everyone have gone down so that the normal is now abnormal. And
Well,
people don't
and
realize
you
that.
look at, well, what's normal? They don't age adjust thyroid. T3 and
Right.
T4 are not age adjusted. It's the same normal when you're 20 and the same normal when you're 80, but they age adjust estrogen, they age adjust testosterone, they age adjust growth hormone. Why? Because we're not supposed to be as vibrant when we're
Yeah.
60 than
Well,
when we were when we were 20.
most of the labs you get from your family doctor don't age adjust it.
Right.
Like, so my level, my baseline level was higher than my PA, my office manager. He's 37. I was 50 when I had my base level taken. So great
Jack,
conversation, Jeff. We covered a lot. It's
yeah, Jack, thank you so much for agreeing to be on tonight. 45 minutes went by very, very quickly. Thank you everybody that stuck it out. We did lose a few people. I don't know if it was the content. I don't know why. I hope that if people had problems with the content, I see a lot of great idea, great information in the chat box. We got a super thanks guys for amazing information. So we did have a lot of people that were happy. I think maybe some people got offended. I hope not. But that's why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I think we need to be aware of what's happening around us, and doc and Dr. Jeff and Friends is about that. It's about people taking control of their own health care, changing the paradigm of the way that people are treated as patients. Whether you're coming in as the provider or you're coming in as the patient, you need to be proactive, and I think that's not happening. And so, thank you everybody for being here. Just some little tidbits to end with. Next week, we're doing a LifeVantage overview. My guest is going to be Lindy Ritsu, who was actually a person that enrolled me in LifeVantage. She's going to be on the call with me. The week after that is going to be another Dr. Jeff and Friends, which is going to be with Lisa Barnes and Christine Baer, who are in the scientific side of LifeVantage. They help formulate some of the products, and they help do some of the research. So they're going to be my guest on Dr. Jeff and Friends. And you can always find these. Go to Dr. Jeff and Friends on either Spotify or Apple if you want to get this, and you can get the video part on my YouTube channel. And if you haven't, most of you know that I lost my Facebook. They thought I was a bot because I was getting so many responses to some of the critical stuff that I was putting out there. So if you haven't sent me a new friend request, find me. I'm just using my first two initials, JL Piccirillo. So send me a new friend request. And that's all we have tonight. Once again, thank you, Dr. Rocco. It's a pleasure to have you on the call. Always love talking to you. And the call's a wrap. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I appreciate it.